Hi, welcome everybody. It's very busy for a Monday morning in Manchester. We're just going to kick off with everybody speaking for 5 minutes on our topic of how to attract more energy investment into the UK. And Dan is going to go first.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Now, being a politician, I've only got 5 minutes, but I'm assuming I'm going to be prodded by the chair if I overrun, because obviously we like to talk. Wow, energy policy. Isn't it simple at the moment and a bit boring? I don't really know why you're all here. I mean, it just seems to me it's rarely been so confusing and rarely been so important. And although we're going to talk a bit about planning here today, and I do want to talk about planning, actually I think the biggest problem facing at the moment is the sheer scale of the investment challenge required for the UK and for Europe and for the globe. It's been estimated by some analysts that the UK, just to meet current energy policy, the UK requires £161 billion of investment by 2020 and £376 billion of investment by 2030. That's without a 2030 decarbonisation target. All other things being equal, that level of investment would see electricity bills rise by 30% by 2020 and 100% by 2030 in real terms. Now, I find it remarkable that we can have such a political consensus across the whole of Europe about the need to decarbonise, and yet have such little consensus about how we go about doing that, about what energy policy should look like, and about what the politics of energy should be in order to achieve our political goals and our energy goals. And here in the UK, I think we sometimes beat ourselves up a bit over our green credentials, yet we're the ones switching off coal, high carbon coal, trying anyway to replace it with lower carbon gas, low carbon nuclear and renewables. And Germany, who are often held up as a paragon of the green virtues, who have higher CO2 emissions per head of the population than the UK and per unit of GDP in the UK, are switching off low carbon nuclear and investing in 20 gigawatts of new lignite coal-fired power stations. So the signals that we're sending to investors and to the marketplace about what we're trying to do in Europe are extremely confusing, and it's no wonder that investors are responding with caution. And here in the UK, just very briefly have to mention the party politics side of it. You know, we have had quite a broad cross-party consensus in what energy policy should look like going forward. You'll notice the Labour Party did not vote against the energy bill. So it'd be very interesting to see whether last week's announcement by the Leader of the Opposition represents a break in that consensus on what UK energy policy going forward should look like. And if it does, I think that would be very damaging, again, to investor confidence. And the UK and Europe don't exist in a vacuum. The World Energy Council last week put out a report estimating that the energy alone investment required globally by 2050 could be some 27 trillion US dollars. And that's just energy. That doesn't include water, doesn't include trains, roads. And these funds are competing. All of those different sectors are competing. And I think that the UK infrastructure requirement going forward to sort of 2020, 2030 and beyond, if you include water, if you include rail, if you include roads, must be phenomenal. And I'm not aware of any one overarching infrastructure project actually looking, a study looking at what UK requirements are. Although having said that, I'm now aware of one because the Conservative Technology Forum have actually decided that they are now going to plan to do a study into future UK infrastructure requirements across the board, marrying up everything. And anybody who's interested in helping with that is very, very welcome to get in touch. So, right, that's the background in terms of energy. That's the crisis, the problem we have in terms of attracting investment funds into the energy sector. And that's even before you meet a planning officer. Now, with a simple and workable planning system, that will be an almighty challenge, but I think we know we don't have a simple and workable planning system. There are a range of issues. I'll just rush through them very quickly so I know we don't have long. One of the problems we have is the sheer uncertain timescales we have in any of these investments. If you're an investor, potential investor in new nuclear, in shale gas, in a large onshore wind farm, how confident are you about the time frame for a return on your investment? I would say not very confident at all. The whole local opposition and sort of, the horrible phrase NIMBY, and I speak as a constituent with high-speed rail coming, an MP with high-speed rail coming through my constituent, where I'm being very NIMBY-ish is a real issue. But what I find fascinating is when you talk to local people who are concerned about a large-scale energy infrastructure project and are opposing it, in the first instance, their opposition is entirely down to construction blight. If you ask people what they're concerned about truck movements, dust, noise, smell. I went down to Hinckley and met with a group of parish council chairmen around the proposed new nuclear power station, and one of the questions was, what pubs are the itinerant workforce going to be drinking in for the years that they're here building this nuclear power station? The fact that somebody was splitting the atom on the doorstep was very, very low down their list of concerns. And in fact, I sometimes think of this with shale gas perhaps as well. If it was a waste to energy plant, if it was anything, you would probably have quite a lot of the local opposition saying a lot of the same things. And the specific concerns about, fracking or whatever often comes later, after people have been on Google, started looking, and then they come up with other reasons to be concerned. But actually, it's very easy to dismiss local concerns to planning, because there are two very legitimate questions for local people to ask when they hear about a new proposal on their doorstep, which is one, is this safe for me, my family, my community? And two, quite frankly, what's in it for us? And I think those two questions are entirely rational. And the safety point is one that there's an onus on industry, and a much bigger, I think, onus on government to tackle myths and to challenge and to explain. Looking at shale gas again, for example, I'm of the view personally that the Environment Agency, the Health and Safety Executive are not getting out there enough challenging some of the myths that we see. Because I have private meetings with them and they tell me they have absolutely no concerns whatsoever about water or cybersecurity. I say, well, where were you then during the Balkan protests? When somebody was interviewing somebody who's concerned about the impact on water, why didn't the camera then pan left to the man from the Environment Agency saying, and this is how we ensure that those problems don't happen? So I think that there's a greater onus on government to be on the front foot on that. But in terms of what's in it for us, I think we can do a lot more. And I think there are two types of ways in which a local community can benefit from having a major infrastructure project on the doorstep. There's the natural, organic benefits, if you like, of a major infrastructure: jobs, investment. Hinkley Point B is estimated to put £40 million a year direct economic benefit into the local economy. And the closer you get to a nuclear power station, support for nuclear power goes up when you ask people whether they support it or not. What does an onshore wind farm give to a local community? Much less in terms of jobs, much less in terms of obvious local economic benefit. So I think it's not surprising really that people are perhaps more concerned when they hear that perhaps a wind farm is going to come on the doorstep. Shell pad, the jury's still out as to just how much local benefit there will be. Then of course you get the artificial community benefit, which we've had a lot of discussions about recently, which is still evolving. It seems to be becoming normal now across energy. Community benefits, there are community benefit schemes in place for onshore wind and they're still developing. We're still talking about the community benefit scheme for new nuclear. And of course we've recently had the outline of the shale gas community benefit scheme. And I think there's a real opportunity if we get that right, for that to make a real difference as well. Because if local communities feel that these projects are something that's being done to them, not something that's being done with them or done with their benefit in mind, quite frankly, I wouldn't blame them for saying, no thank you, we don't want that on our doorstep. That's probably my 5 minutes up. That was a little bit of a rambling jump between investment and planning, but hopefully when we get into a question and answer session we can tease some of those issues out a bit more.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. Paddy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Rowena. Thanks, Dan. I'll try and pick up on a couple of points that Dan's mentioned and maybe take the conversation in a slightly different direction as well. I work with ESB. We've been investing in Britain for the last 20 years in gas-fired power stations and wind power, and also investing in Northern Ireland with transmission network and wind and gas-fired power stations as well. And it's a very interesting time to be an energy infrastructure investor at the moment. And interesting times are really something that fills investors with confidence. Dan talked about the time scale over which investors can make a return with various different types of energy infrastructure, and I think this is a really key point. We have just decided to build a power station down the road in Carrington. We started building that this year. It's going to be ready in early 2016. But the timeline for us and the amount of expenditure before we got to an investment decision, as we went through the planning process, is actually enormous. It's many millions of pounds and it's many years. And the investment cycles are so long, and the return, the requirement for return is so long term, that it's really important for investors to have some understanding of a reasonably predictable energy market framework and investment framework out into the future. And I think everybody understands that it's impossible to get absolute certainty, and there are many things which are in the lap of the gods in terms of fuel prices and demand and so on. But because of that, it's really important to have, as much as possible, some long-term certainty looking out there that energy policy and energy regulation is going to be for the long term, that it's going to be beyond election cycles, that it's looking out over 10 or 15 years, and that there's a consensus really that changes in policy are going to be flagged, and the ship is going to be steered, and that changes are going to be gradual and going to be flagged and going to be logical. Because the long-term nature of this investment means that investors are going to put their money elsewhere unless they're confident that they can make the returns over a long period of time. I think the tone as well is really important, the tone of the debate. So for us investing at the moment in gas-fired technology here in Carrington, it's very helpful for us to have an understanding that the government and the department see gas as a big part of the transition from maybe the older, less efficient mix of power generation that's currently there to the new world of higher levels of decarbonisation. And the gas strategy and the acknowledgement that gas is a big part of the solution really helps the tone for the investors. It really helps in understanding that the investment is going to be needed in the market. It's a time of great change with the market reforms, and we understand why market reform is needed, and we welcome the progress that's being made on passing the bill. We welcome the progress that's being made on the detailed design. But I suppose there are two caveats. One is, from an investment point of view, we can see a little bit of a hiatus at the moment in terms of investment in power generation, even at a time where forecasts out into the future are that the system margin is going to decrease, and we think a lot of that is generated by people waiting to see the exact nature and the exact form of particularly the capacity payment mechanism. And we would caution that it's really important that the capacity payment mechanism is well thought through, so that it's attracting new investment and longer term investment. And that's really important, because it would be very easy for the capacity payment mechanism to incentivise older, less efficient plants to stay on the bars. And as long as that happens, it's pushing out the newer investment. So it's really important to get that balance between short-term security of supply and long-term investment. And we welcome the work that the government's doing at the moment in relation to that. Also in relation to investment, there is, particularly for players like ourselves or other people who haven't got a big position in the market, access into the market is really important. The ability to be able to get your electricity sold, or if you're a supply company, to be able to access wholesale electricity to sell in the retail market, that access is really important. So there's a lot of work happening at the moment between various energy utilities and the regulators in order to improve the liquidity and the access of particularly the smaller players in the market into that wholesale market, which is really important for both investment and competition. So we're committed to investment in Carrington. We're really looking forward to building that out over the next couple of years, and we're also applying for planning permission for another investment in Yorkshire, and we're going through the process that Dan was referring to there, paying particular attention to the local community, paying particular attention to trying to make sure that this investment is good, not just for the market, but also for the people in the local area, in terms of the investment and the jobs that are going to come, and also making sure that the plant, not just the build, but the long-term sustainable operation of the generation station is in keeping with the needs of the local community. So, as I said, it's a very interesting time to be part of energy infrastructure investment here, and I'm really looking forward to the debate for the rest of the morning.
Thanks very much, Paddy. Andrew from RBS.
Right, thanks very much. You will, I'm sure, know RBS reasonably well. You may know RBS in the energy sector less well, so let me spend a moment, if I may, just introducing what we do. I run essentially two teams, one of which is focused on power, the other on oil and gas, so very much an energy sector focus. We've been lending to the energy sector since privatisation in this country. We've financed about 9 gigawatts of renewables globally, but we have financed in that same time a tremendous amount of thermal traditional power as well. These days our focus is very firmly on the UK market, although at the end of last year we were lending something like £7 billion on a global basis to energy-related projects. So this is something we've been doing for a very long time, and prior to the crisis in a wide range of different jurisdictions. I think that gives us an interesting perspective in that we've seen how things work or perhaps don't work in many other countries. And I would start with a couple of positive remarks to say pretty much it has been our experience that regardless of, not quite regardless, but to a large degree, the regulatory policy, as long as it has three things, can lead to successful financings. I'll come back to what those three things are in a moment. But the critical part for us is that we need to have an in-depth understanding of the framework. The energy sector is something that banks such as ourselves have supported in large degree for a long time. It provides very predictable, generally, cash flows, and therefore it's something that the banks like lending to. It connects very well to lots of other things that we like to do for our clients as well. I would mention at this point that we were delighted to be leading in the charge of financing Carrington. So, like Paddy, we are very much in that project for the long term as well. Now back to the three things. What are the three things that are most important for us when we're judging the attractiveness or otherwise of a market? Transparency, predictability, and durability. Those are the three key things. If you have those as an investor, you can probably go forward and make sensible decisions about investing in a particular project or a particular country. And that's all about the fact that this is fundamentally a very long-term business. We have had experience in other markets where regulations have been changed retroactively. We've many examples of that across Europe at the moment. And that is exactly the sort of thing that makes my credit colleagues very, very nervous. We have, obviously, and I'm not looking for sympathy here, but we have no upside as a bank. The best that you can hope for is you get your money paid back. Everything else is worse, which tends to explain why we tend to be quite negative and cynical types. But in that context, what you absolutely don't want is the risk or the feeling that the environment in which you're investing is subject to a major change, or that there could be curveballs thrown into your way. And with that, I would echo very much what Paddy was just saying around the long-term predictability. I would also echo his comments about the steps being undertaken under electricity market reform being very welcome. I would mention at this point that I co-chair the Low Carbon Finance Group, which is an informal grouping of energy lenders and investors, primarily independent investors. And in that context, I've spent a tremendous amount of time over the last 2.5, maybe nearly 3 years now, on the EMR journey. It's been slow, it's been occasionally very frustrating, but I think we are in a much better place now than we were. That said, I also think that I must flag it's probably still far too early to say will this deliver everything we need it to, simply because I will only be able to judge that once I've taken the first 2 or 3 projects with all the details, all their warts and bumps through our credit process. And that's going to involve having the lawyers working for us, going through all of the documents and the challenge process that we have on any project, and actually with the added difficulty or the added novelty that this will be the first time that we're doing this under the new arrangements. So I think a clarity on future direction of travel is absolutely essential. I think to this point we've broadly been very lucky in this country that there has been broad cross-party consensus on energy policy. Events of last week, as Dan mentioned, may suggest that that's perhaps diverging now, which again I would see as a thing that would make us somewhat nervous. The good news, therefore, conscious of time, is that I think lenders want to be doing things in this sector. The bad news is we haven't done very much this year at all as a bank, or indeed as a sector. It's been painfully slow. We've had a really healthy pipeline of things that we would like to lend money to, and for varying reasons they have not happened. Some of that's planning, that's normal, we take that on the chin. A lot more of it is, to be honest, uncertainty around EMR and the needing to get that landed as soon as we possibly can. Because if we are to hit the 110 billion of new investment over the next 10 years or so that we think we need, we can't do it with the current players. The banks, there were 50 or so of pre-crisis lending to this sector. There are probably about 10 or 12 now, and we are each lending typically a little bit less per project than we used to. So you need to attract new debt capital. You also need to attract new equity in there, because the utilities themselves have very strained balance sheets. Most of them have, or a lot of them have, nuclear decommissioning in Germany. They have other construction projects they need to do in their home markets and other places as well. So they are not the limitless pot of cash that we would like them to be, quite apart from the broader sort of policy wishes of wanting to get some further competition into the sector. And I would mention there that the lending that we do tends to support the independent generators such as ESB, because we find that the utilities don't use our particular brand of debt being project finance, i.e. specific to one project. They generally just borrow as a corporate. So clarity on direction, a feeling that whatever we are getting will stay in place for a long and predictable period is very, very important, particularly for the new investors, because I think we start with slightly of a head start, knowing that we've been in this market for 20 plus years, as I mentioned. If you're sitting in a foreign boardroom somewhere, considering whether to come into the UK, you have all sorts of competing investment destinations, and if it takes you 20 or 30 minutes to explain the investment regime to your investment committee, you've lost the battle already. You will not win that because it's just too complex. And that's probably a fear or a nervousness which I would sound at the moment about some of the aspects of EMR, because they are tremendously complicated. And we've taken the time to try to understand them. We're not quite there yet, there's still some detail to land. But I do fear that on some of the points, and I certainly don't have time to go into specifics now, but maybe we can do it in debate, we are trying to be a little bit too clever and a little bit too detailed. And that sort of stuff scares away the type of investors that I speak to on a fairly frequent basis. I'll probably call it to a close there, conscious of time, but I'm hoping we'll get some very good debate. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and finally, Guy from Policy Exchange.
Thanks very much, Rowena. Thanks everyone for coming. For those of you who don't know Policy Exchange, we're a think tank, which means we host events like this and we produce original research. I head up our environment and energy work, which is focused on how we achieve our environmental targets as cost effectively as possible, and it's both the cost effectiveness and the importance of environmental targets which we think sets us apart from everyone else. I don't want to repeat anything that's been said earlier, but the key point I want to make is that the more that investment is reliant on government decision making, the more vulnerable it is to the whims of policymakers. I think over the last 10 years we've seen a move in the UK away from decisions being made in the market with risk sitting with investors, where as much of it should sit, in my opinion, to decisions being made by government. And in many ways, Ed Miliband's contribution to the debate last week was the kind of logical conclusion of that, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Very briefly on the planning issue, well, we do have a kind of sclerotic planning system in the UK. We can't get new homes built, for example, and it's equally a problem in energy infrastructure, whether it's wind, shale, or gas. Part of that reason, and the point I'd just make on that, is that we seem to be somewhat nervous about compensating people properly for development nearby. that's not to say that bribing people, incentives, whatever you want to call it, is going to solve all our problems. But it seems that's where the impact is, and people should be compensated for that. I want to focus a bit more on investment decisions, and particularly the energy bill. I think there's major risks with the way we're heading on the energy bill and contracts for difference. As Andrew pointed out, the complexity is extraordinary, and the idea that the taps of investment are going to be opened over the next few years seems still to be proven, I think. And the key question is, the kind of raison d'etre of the energy bill. Well, is it going to reduce the cost of capital for new investment projects? And I'd probably be interested to hear Andrew's and others' views on that. The conversations I have, I'm not convinced that it's made a huge difference at all. What would a better, simpler investment framework look like if we're talking about tackling the environmental imperatives? Well, number one, we need a clear carbon price. Policy Exchange's preferred method is through the emissions trading scheme and getting that functioning. And I'd stress the point that if we don't get a clear carbon price at a European level, then we're not really serious about tackling climate change, in my opinion. And the suggestion that we're going to be able to do it through choosing technologies and subsidising them is far-fetched. There should be limited support for deployment, but that support should be dependent on the cost coming down, and it should also be bear in mind where the costs of that lie. But we should be having a much more sophisticated discussion about which technologies we support and to what extent. I think, sadly, much of the debate has been about how we meet an arbitrary renewable energy target. And I think the third point, and feeds into the political, is that there should be a clear commitment that the risk should sit as much as possible with investors and those making decisions, not with consumers, and sadly we tend to be moving in the other direction. Intervention has bred intervention. The capacity mechanism falls on top of the energy bill, and you end up with Miliband's proposal in lots of ways. The most likely end result, although it's still very unclear to me at least what exactly Labour are proposing, but the end result is regulated prices. Now, that might suit lots of people in the energy business. It might suit independents and others, but the evidence suggests that won't be the best deal for consumers. But at least Miliband is being, to some extent, upfront about the direction that we're travelling. That said, I think his proposals they're kind of ill-considered, and I've described it as populism dressed up as bravery. I think it's already had a negative effect, not just on share prices, but on the whole investment climate. And I'm sure people who are writing contracts for difference will be working out how they deal with more price uncertainty there. I guess the wider point, which come back to the point I was making at the start, is if you depend on government decision making, then you're going to have more political risk. And it seems to me that of all the risks that are out there for a new project, be it carbon risk, the cost of gas, finance, etc., political risk is the hardest to deal with, and that is why I feel that the general direction we're heading is so risky.
Thanks very much, Guy. So we're going to open the floor up to questions. First of all, I just wanted to ask the other panellists whether you agree with Guy that political risk is going up, and what you think of the Labour proposals.
I think absolutely. I think the strategic political risk is probably the biggest and hardest to quantify risk facing investors and operators in the energy sector. Absolutely. And as I alluded to earlier, I think Miliband's proposal fuels that and makes it worse. And it's not entirely his fault. It was there anyway. And this government's doing a lot to feed it as well. And as are other European countries. You've only got to look at Spain. I think one of the problems we've got on the political front is there are too many politicians who think that you can sharpen your pencil and design what you think the ideal low-carbon world might look like in 2050, and then wave your legislative magic wand and make it happen. And of course that's completely impractical. Without a credible, and here's a key word, investable roadmap to get from where we are now to where we want to be in 2050, it won't happen. And I think Spain shows what happens when politicians just wave their magic wand and suddenly there's a 35 billion euro black hole in their energy policy, and they're having to retrospectively change contracts, etc. And so I think the Miliband proposal is part, as Guy very clearly said, it's the next logical step given the politicisation we've already had in terms of energy. And we're so far now from having a free market in energy that I sometimes think we should just stop pretending we have. Maybe let's just nationalise it or go back to regulated industries. Or it's just why pretend we've got this free market when we haven't.
I'd absolutely echo that in the sense that I think we find ourselves in a very strange position at the moment, it seems to me, where as an investor we are being asked, or first we're being told the market should make the investment decisions, and it's healthy and appropriate that should be the case, and I think we broadly all agree with that. So the market should therefore take the risk. Again, broadly fine with that. But then, here comes the complexity. The approach, because of the politicisation of costs and the cost to consumer, again, entirely understandable, we seem to be existing, or heading at least, to a very interventionist role for government, which I don't think we've seen in the 20-odd years since privatisation, and one in which the investment case that we as investors and new incoming investors are asked to accept is, please accept unlimited downside risk, but we want to cap your upside. And that is, for me, untenable, because on the one end of the spectrum you have a regulated asset base, everything is regulated, it's the way the US used to run it, it's the way we ran it for a short while, and the utility makes the case saying, I need 2 new power stations, they're allowed to recover their cost plus 3% or RPI or whatever it might be, and there's a formula, that's fine. Very low risk, low return business, they can invest lots of money on that basis. Or you say, right, smart people in the market, you decide, you make the risk decisions and allocate your capital accordingly, and if it goes really well you may make lots of money, and if it doesn't you'll lose lots. Again, that seems to me okay. What isn't okay is telling people to accept unlimited downside, i.e. the market takes the nasty bits, but capping the upside, because that simply does not work. And I fear that there are some pretty complex elements of the energy bill which seem to me to do that. And I think that's the area of complexity which I find probably the most problematic for incoming investors. Again, as I said, people who are here already, for whom it's their home market, will ultimately get their heads around it. We want to be lending, we want to be supporting this market. But this isn't probably the easiest way of attracting lots of new capital.
Paddy, do you want to add anything?
So, just a couple of things occurred to me. It's a bit like, the risk of your house being burgled is there, but if your house was burgled last week, you're much more conscious of that risk. The risk is probably still the same. And I think with the regulatory and the legislative environment at the moment, or the political risk at the moment, the risk is always there. It's just the tone or the debate and the fact that it's at the forefront of people's minds means that there's a heightened sense of that risk. And I think for the investment community, it's all very well to go into a boardroom and say, dear directors, that risk has always been there. It's the same risk. We could have made the investment last year and this could have happened. It's very different to be making that argument when the risk, people's consciousness of this risk is very much heightened by the fact that uncertainty is being spoken about. So I think the tone is really important for investment. And Andrew talked about predictability and stability and endurance and so on. And that sets the tone for investment, which I think is important. Going back to Guy's point about who manages, let's say, the different types of risk, which is the risk of decarbonising at the best price, making sure the prices are right, managing the energy markets, the world energy markets, and their impact on the competitive price of electricity, and so on. My belief is that the market is best suited for managing that the investors in the energy market are best placed to manage those risks on behalf of customers, and that they are also best placed to make the decisions about which carbon reducing technologies to invest in. But again, the framework within which those decisions are driven is is always interesting. Like I would personally agree with Guy about the emissions trading scheme as being ideally the best way of driving investment decisions in decarbonisation. On the other hand, it's shown over a number of years not to give the answer that drives that investment. So, you know, how's that going to change in the future, and are going to be people going to be confident about that? So, overall, I think that right now we're seeing an absence of investment. And Andrew spoke about it. There is not a huge amount of investment in energy infrastructure right now. In general, I think it's because people are waiting. They're waiting for a little bit more certainty. They're waiting so that the tone of the discussions around energy policy are more stable. And I think that the point that was made earlier about bringing EMR to a close, making sure that it's right, and then ideally having some sort of general consensus about being in there for the long haul is really the most important thing. If further, which is much needed investment, is going to be attracted in the near future.
Who's got some more questions? This lady in there.
Thanks, Helmut Cage, on your trust. Yeah, sorry. Thanks very much for the contributions. I suppose I'd like to pick up on what Dan said about maybe we should stop pretending it's a free market. And I suppose my question is from a consumer point of view. I represent an environmental organisation, but we've looked a lot at energy, and we think there should be a National Energy Commission with independent experts on it, because we don't believe that there's the evidence that Ofgem and DEC are looking after the consumer. And frankly, when Ed Davies stands and says the consumer's getting taken £9 a year off them for green policies, as he did a couple of weeks ago, no wonder folk are having trouble believing what they're told. So I suppose I would add to the things like transparency and stability that the industry want, honestly, and I suppose my question is, do you think Ofgem and DEC are doing a job for the consumer?
Can I say, I completely agree. Because I only had 5 minutes, I didn't say something that I've often say when I'm speaking at these events, which is that I think we have a real lack of honesty from government and governments across Europe about what we're doing and what it's going to cost. I mean, I'm on the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee. I chair the All-Party Environment Group and the All-Party Group for Unconventional Oil and Gas. And I often find myself sitting around a table with government officials, industry, academics, all talking about how we're switching off the cheapest forms of producing energy and replacing it with the most expensive forms of producing energy. And the person missing from around that table is the consumer, who is ultimately going to pay for it all. And one of the most dishonest things you often hear from governments and civil servants, I don't think they're doing it deliberately, it's just the way they think, is they use the term reducing your energy bills when they mean stopping your energy bills rising as much as they otherwise might have done under a different scenario. And the trouble with that is you lose people. And a classic example is the Green Deal. If you sell somebody on the Green Deal, go and get this loan, do this, and your energy bill next year will be lower. So they do it, and their energy bill next year is £50 higher. And they complain. You say, oh, but it would have been £150 higher if you hadn't done it. I'm sorry, that's dishonest, and you've lost them, and then they don't trust what you say next. So I think you're absolutely right. I think, we know that if we get this 110 billion, is it 176 billion by 2030, is it 376 billion? If we get that investment, which we want, bills are going to be higher, and energy bills profits. Energy companies' profits are going to be higher in absolute terms. You don't invest £300 billion and not have a bigger profit at the end of it, or even on the same percentage. And I think governments also need to be honest with the energy companies. Are they going to accept by 2030 energy bills being 100% higher in real terms than they are today, and the energy companies' profits being bigger? I'm not going to answer that. Sorry.
Anyone else? This gentleman behind.
Hi, Patrick Wilson with Babcock and Wilcox. I was wondering, Andrew, about your question about the downside risk being substantial and the upside being limited. It's kind of a kickoff on Dan's point. What do you think about the commitment to these very, very large nuclear new build projects? They're very capital intensive and they're looking more uncertain all the time. What's your view about whether they'll actually be completed in time to provide power for Britons?
That's a very good question. I could answer that in a number of different ways. I'm trying to think of the most appropriate way of doing so. I mean, as a bank, we don't have a perspective on nuclear other than to say that we watch it closely, because if it does become an important component of the market, then we need to understand the impact it will have on the rest of the market prices and predictability, because that's the sort of assessment that we make on other technologies, and it feeds into anything that we would be investing in the electricity sector. I think it is fascinating to have seen the progress of those negotiations. I'm not involved in them at all, so I just go by what I hear and what people say to me around events such as this. I think it is interesting that we've gone from a situation in which we had a number of parties to one in which really there is only one currently. And as a commercial matter, it's probably hard to see how you necessarily drive the firmest of deals in that respect. Beyond that, I'm not involved in the discussions, and so I can't really comment, save to say that with the exception of China, where their approach to permitting, planning and related issues is perhaps more robust than in the Western world, we have yet to see in recent years a nuclear plant being built on time and on budget, and that's one of the other things that I think would certainly caveat our own, and by our I'm now meaning the lending community generally, interest in lending on a project finance basis to a nuclear power station, because if you look at Flamanville or you look at Olkiluoto, they are both at least 5 billion euros over budget, and they're both 5 or 6 years late already and getting later. So, current estimate, current forecast is Hinkley Point by 2020, I think. That slipped a fair bit. Whether it will slip further, I honestly can't say.
This lady in the centre.
Claire Durkin, URS. I agree very much with an awful lot that's been said on the panel, but I want to change the tone a little bit, because it seems to me that actually we ought to have been able to present today incredibly confident, because unlike many areas of the Western world, we have huge advantages in that we have said, and there has been cross-party consensus, on new nuclear. We talked about new nuclear fleet, I even recall the phrase. We have a good grid system, and we have a good system by which we are going to reconfigure the grid that will make it work. We have offshore oil and gas coming onshore. I mean, what joy is that? We are blessed. And finally, we actually do have an independent regulator, however much we tweak them. So in comparison with many, many other Western countries where investors are looking to invest, we have huge advantages. We also have a reasonably intelligent security of supply, intellectual structure, but boy do we like tweaking that structure. The downside of where we are is over-intellectualization and lack of vim, vigour and confidence on the government side. If we could stop tweaking the structure and start investing hugely and speaking confidently and easily about our advantages, we would see the money flowing, and I really don't see any major impediment if we do have that sense of confidence. And I want to know from the panel where the voice is going to come from, the steady, strong voice of calm that is demonstrably showing that we are actually an enormously advantageous country to invest in.
Well, could I put it back on you? Say, who do you think it should come from? Because it's a really good point that it's very easy to give it doom and gloom. And in fact, when I have my other hat on, when I'm trying to sort of sell Britain abroad, I sound a lot more like you just did. I was out in the UAE before Christmas, banging the table, saying, look, EMR's there on the table now. You can come back and open your pockets and start investing in the UK again, because there was quite a clear pause from overseas investment when the draft energy bill was being kicked around and people just didn't know what it was going to look like. I suppose in a sense it's a bit of a collective, isn't it? We need the government to set the calm tone. We've discussed about the predictability and durability of government policy, a degree of consensus across political parties, which we have had up to now, which I hope that this Edinburgh thing actually in broad terms won't change. The real telling point there will be third reading of the energy bill. or whatever we're coming up to next. I'll lost track of where we are now. Yeah. Anyway, but the Labour Party did not vote against the energy bill. They abstained on it, and they created a false argument about 2030 decarbonisation target. So we had something to argue about. Absolutely clear that was what it was about. He virtually admitted it to me. So if the Labour Party continue to not oppose the energy bill going forward, then hopefully that means actually we're going to continue with the broad consensus, and that's the fundamental point. Because if we've got a broad political consensus, then all of those other natural advantages that we have in the UK in terms of our natural resources, our incredible infrastructure that we already have, will be much, much easier then to sell, because the framework around it will also be durable. So I think government does need to fly the flag, but people don't always believe governments. This is a problem, which is why I kind of pushed it back to asking who you thought it should be. I mean, it's an interesting question. Can it be industry itself? Can it be the UK investment community? Who should be the people standing up saying, if you're an international investor and you're not sure where your money should go, come and look at Britain?
I mean, I think to a degree, success breeds success. So the proof of this will start to come, I hope, once we have all the detail and the energy bill is passed and the first few projects are successfully funded and being deployed rapidly. Because at that point, people who are sitting currently on the sidelines will look at that, one hopes, and conclude, well, actually, that looks like a really good place to invest. I think that the note of caution which I sounded earlier still applies, though, because it seems to me that in some of the discussions I have had with DEC, that there is a nervousness about letting the private sector make, quotes, too much money. And there is this very political, and I understand from where it comes, and it's a very natural reaction, but there's a very political nervousness about what happened with the private finance initiative. Let's get that out there. Private contractors did make quite a lot of money. Perhaps the contracts could have been negotiated differently. That's history. But I think the nervousness about that then drives this sort of view in which, well, we may tweak it again, to use your words, if it looks like people are making too much money. Well, actually, arguably, that's exactly when you shouldn't be tweaking it, because if it's great, and the first few people who have taken the risk of doing something in an unfamiliar market are rewarded for that, new ones come in, compete, the price will come down. That's how markets generally are supposed to work. And that would be a good thing, because then you're creating a demand for the ability to invest. One other point I would make is that the decision makers are very swayed by what they see in the media. If you think back to about 2 and a bit years ago, when we had lots of debate about the banding for the renewables obligation, specifically on onshore wind, I had very, very senior people in my organisation phoning me up or emailing me saying, what on earth's going on? It's on the front page of the FT, it's on the front page of pretty much all the newspapers. Doesn't seem like there is parliamentary consensus on this at all. Why on earth should we invest in this? That's perhaps turning it round, that's how not to get the message out. So absolutely, to Dan's point, as broad a political consensus as is possible, but please let's try and get the messaging around this as close as we can as well. Because if government does its bit and industry does its bit, and we're talking about the same sort of things, that's quite a powerful message which I think will succeed. If we all fractionalise and you have onshore wind here and biomass here and nuclear there and shale gas, and it's too fragmented, and I fear it won't work.
Rowena, can I just make one point on that? Well, first of all, Claire, as somebody who works at a think tank, I'm all in favour of over-intellectualisation. Every opportunity is basically my life. But the point is well made in this context. I think I bring it back to my point. The problem is, if you set up a system where more and more decisions have to be made by government actors, then this kind of uncertainty is inevitable, because politicians will be swayed by politics. That's the inevitable process. So as many decisions aren't made by politicians, so therefore it's not on the front page anymore, it's in the business pages, then the much more likely we are to get the kind of investment we need in the long run, and that's why I worry about the kind of general direction we're heading.
Well, sorry, can I just, I work for a company and we're, our centre of gravity is in Ireland in terms of our balance sheet and our revenue. But we find Britain a great place to invest. Like we are investing here, and we're investing not just right now. We've invested in over the last 20 years, and we're increasing our investments here for all the reasons, Claire, that you spoke about in terms of, the contract law and certainty and stability and transparency. And I think we're at a particular, in the energy area, there's a particular time. I spoke earlier about cycle times, and a couple of weeks ago I visited one of our generating stations. It's a hydro station. It was built in 1927. It's still generating, so that's 80 or 90 years ago. 90 years old, it's still doing what it's doing. We're rebuilding it and it's still going to keep going. Whereas our plant in Corby at the moment is less than 20 years old, and it operates very, very seldom. It's only really when there's a capacity margin tightness in the area that it runs. So the cycle times for investment are changing, the demand patterns are changing, the technology, the other side of energy infrastructure investment that we haven't really spoken about today in terms of the demand side, smart metering, changing the response of consumers, and all of that, I think is making the investment on the large scale infrastructure, is changing the cycle times for that, and it's making people look at that in a different way. The other thing is, I was just thinking as you were talking, looking back many years ago, really the balance for government and for regulators was to get the balance between security of supply and cost and competitive energy supply. There's now that third element in there about carbonisation and sustainability, which really makes this a very, very difficult balancing act for government. And I think we're in the middle of all of that at the moment. And if we could just get some clarity, some sustainable clarity and framework around that, and to take away, let's say, the perception of increased risk that there is now, because this is very much up in the air, and take that away, I think all the other factors are there in this economy for investment.
This gentleman over here.
Thank you. John Robinson from Newark. I'm looking at the executive summary of your European emissions trading system.
Good.
It's blaming the weakening of the ETS on the financial crisis on European economies. One of the main factors in a lack of growth in this country, and indeed throughout Europe, is the high cost of energy. And a lot of that high cost is totally artificial. We shouldn't have an emissions trading scheme. We shouldn't have anything. There are you people who make energy, in whatever way you produce it, and you've got a market to serve. And you should be left to get on with it. I'm totally agreeing that there's too much political involvement. Great Britain should be separate from Europe anyway, and then we will prosper even more. But really, nuclear is the only way to decarbonise, isn't it? We all know that, really. The amount of waste of energy in creating these wind farms, the one in the Highlands that's proposed at the moment, 40 miles of new roads, and the amount of the consumption of energy, the exuding emissions of carbon, ridiculous. I'm sorry, but can we not get away from the politicians? Can we not persuade them to let us just get on with the job?
Shall I defend my report? Well, first of all, I don't think the emissions trading scheme is putting up the price of energy greatly, because it's giving a very, very low price signal at all. It's hardly anything. That's part of the problem with it at the moment. What else? Nuclear. Well, first of all, I don't think we can meet our climate obligations without nuclear. That doesn't necessarily mean that the current proposals in Hinkley is the best technology, but it's important to it's important to say that building a nuclear power station in an open competitive market hasn't happened anywhere in the world. So the idea that nuclear as a subsidy-free option is just wrong in my opinion. It might be cheaper than some of the alternatives, but it's very hard to build it without the taxpayer getting involved, at least in the models we've had so far.
Firms get 3/4 from it, don't they? Nuclear?
They do, and they've paid a hell of a price to build it all. And they might be enjoying the cheap benefits now, but it's very difficult to disentangle exactly how they're involved. I think it's safe to say that the French government are pretty closely involved in the nuclear power industry.
Just sorry, on the charge of politicians getting out of the way. I mean, I'm a very government sceptic MP, which I tend to feel that governments usually get the wrong answer in most things they go into, and the more money involved, the more wrong they tend to be. So my sentiments are very much with you, except that, as you said, as Paddy said earlier, back when it was simply energy security and affordability, it was much easier. Now that we have decarbonisation in, and whatever your views of decarbonisation, it is there. We have accepted it as a nation. We've accepted it as a globe, really, and decarbonise. There we have very strong international commitments to decarbonise, and that changes the nature. You can't just allow the free market now completely unencumbered. There are free market solutions involving properly pricing carbon and other ways that might perhaps have enabled a more efficient way of decarbonising while maintaining a better free market in energy. And I share a lot of people who have said it is concerned that we don't appear to be doing that. We appear to be going down a highly prescriptive, highly complex, government pulls every single lever. I mean, I occasionally be a bit cheeky and say, the energy bill is the energy dictator bill. It now means that the Secretary of State for Energy decides what technology we have, in what percentages, where it goes, how much it can charge, what price it gets for its energy. We're so far away from allowing the free market to do it that it's just crazy.
We've got time for one more question.
Hi there. Sam Main, Brunswick. I just want to ask a question about trust. Why is it that the energy business tends to not make very much profit margin, as we tend to hear, that the profit margins are extremely thin, and yet at the same time is seen as enough of a whipping boy for the leader of the opposition to feel like he can shake it down? Like, how has that come about? I mean, who's to blame there? Is the industry not telling its story, or are politicians tarring the wrong person with a brush?
I think both. I think it comes back to this honesty point from our first question, which is that governments like to blame the fact that energy prices are rising on the nasty energy companies. The nasty energy companies like to blame it all on the government because the government are imposing the renewable all these obligations on us. And I think neither side are being particularly honest. And I mean, the interesting analogy was the supermarkets. We need to heat our homes. We also need to eat. Over 90% of the energy markets captured by the big six. 88% of the supermarket market, whatever you call it, sector, are the 6 largest supermarkets. Yeah, and food costs have been going up beyond inflation as well. Yet you don't have the same degree of attacking on the supermarkets. It's quite interesting. But in terms of what was I going to say? I started about supermarkets. I forgot what I was going to say. It'll come back to me. Sorry.
Anyone else? And on the trust issue.
Yeah, I'd leap in and again echo that. I think that the message has been very poorly disseminated. I think if you went and asked the average person on the street, from where does your energy come? Do you understand how it gets to your light switch? Nobody has a clue. It's a complex system, but I don't think we've ever actually had the courage to start to try and have that debate with people. And I think in an environment where the vast bulk of increases in recent years are driven by wholesale gas prices, I don't think that's widely understood. Now, yes, there is a component of populism which says the energy industry profiteers from that wholesale gas price. Maybe to a degree, some of them are able to indeed benefit from that. But I just don't think that it's perhaps too boring in one sense, in that it's very, very complicated. It's a little bit nerdy, and nobody actually invests the time or energy in understanding it. And we've done, as an industry, a pretty poor job, I think, in having that more open debate with the consumer.
I've remembered what I was going to say, so if I could, which was that we've very recently in the Select Committee actually done an inquiry into profits and pricing, and our conclusions were quite interesting. So our conclusions were that there's clearly a massive perception of profiteering, that perception of profiteering is probably not supported by the facts. But the energy companies make it very difficult because they are very opaque in the way they report their profits. They make 3% in this bit, but they're all sort of vertically integrated. They make 20% over here on a different sector, and the perception that they're actually transfer pricing and choosing to move where the profits are made. And in our sector, we found it very hard to untangle and follow the money through some of the large sort of integrated companies, which means the consumer will find it almost impossible. So our view was the evidence didn't support that they are profiteering, but actually it's quite hard to point to the evidence also firmly that they're not. And that if we could end up with a more transparent and easier way of actually seeing, where the profits are falling. And I'm not anti-profit at all. I share the whole point that, if we want to attract investment, companies need to make a profit, need to have a pretty good idea what profits they're going to make, and they need to know they're not going to get pilloried for it or have it taken away in a windfall tax. But it's the lack of transparency in terms of seeing where the profits are made or not that I think leads to people being cynical. Sorry, Paddy.
No, I don't. I think there's, maybe just taking Dan's point about, going to a supermarket or paying your energy bill. I think it's difficult, and we don't have a retail position in Britain, but it's difficult to be popular when you're giving somebody a bill every couple of months, really. And when the bill arrives, it's very difficult for people to appreciate what it was that they got for that, because it's just the lights were on. Whereas if you go to a supermarket, you're paying it. Or if you go and buy a car, whether the car is expensive or whether BMW or whoever, Vauxhall or whoever making money, you've a choice to do that, and you get something physical and substantial for it, and you make a choice and you pay at the time. Whereas electricity is a very different type of product. I think it's difficult. I think the points about transparency and understanding, it's boring. It's by the time you've started explaining this to people, they're they lose the will to live. It's a very difficult proposition for people, I think, particularly at a time where electricity has been so reliable for the last number of years, many years.
Just on it, well, first of all, the companies haven't helped themselves often. Doorstop mis-selling, horrendously overcomplicated tariffs as people see it. That doesn't help. The second point is a political one. Politicians give the impression that they can control this, that they can control prices. When you were in power, bills went up by 25%. Oh, in the 3 years since you've been in power, they've gone up by X percent, right? The truth is that their ability to control a lot of that is pretty minimal. But if you create the impression politically that you can control these bills, then people will expect you to control it. And of course, then you lead to the Miliband situation inevitably, and then you have a very difficult message to say that actually the way you keep bills as low as possible is as much competition, and that is not straightforward to tell
people. Does he have the
people.
power to actually does he actually legally have that power?
Well, who knows?
Everybody knows.
It's up for debate, I think, yeah.
They might do.
Probably not as things stand, but of course if you pass primary legislation, I don't know if that would be in clash with any other piece of
It'd be interesting in European.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I think that's all we've got time for, but thanks very much to our wonderful panel and everybody for coming, and I hope you all have a great conference.